The chandeliers above the grand hall glittered like frozen rain, scattering gold light across marble floors polished to a mirror shine, and beneath them stood a woman who owned more paintings than most museums could ever hope to display. Selina Sterling raised her glass and announced, in a voice sharpened by years of command, that $7,000 would go to anyone who could translate the ancient manuscript resting under glass at the center of the room. Professors from 3 continents had already failed that very evening. Historians with decades of experience had shaken their heads and walked away in quiet defeat, unwilling to risk their reputations on a text they could not decipher. Then, from the back of the hall, a man in a worn gray suit rose slowly from his seat, and the room erupted into laughter before he had even reached the stage. He introduced himself simply as Adrian Cole, a freelance translator, and Selina's smile curled into something close to mockery as she reminded him, loud enough for every guest to hear, that the prize was not intended for people chasing lucky guesses. What happened in the next few minutes would leave every powerful person in that room standing in stunned, humbled silence, and no one there would ever forget it. Adrian Cole was 38 years old, and to anyone who passed him on the street, he looked like nothing more than a tired father doing his best to get by from one week to the next. He raised his daughter alone, ever since the accident that had taken his wife 3 years earlier on a rain-soaked highway. And he built his entire life around her school schedule, her quiet laughter at the dinner table, and the small rituals that kept their little apartment feeling like a home instead of a memorial. By day, he took freelance translation jobs from anyone willing to pay a fair rate, drafting legal contracts for overworked small law firms, untangling dry technical manuals no one else wanted to touch, and occasionally polishing academic papers for graduate students too exhausted to finish their own footnotes. His clients rarely asked questions about his background, and Adrian rarely offered any, content to remain a quiet, reliable name at the bottom of an invoice rather than a headline in anyone's newspaper. Every evening, no matter how tired the day had left him, Adrian made a point of sitting at the small kitchen table with his daughter, Lily, helping her sound out spelling words while dinner simmered on the stove behind them. She was 7 years old, quick with questions, and utterly unaware that the man patiently correcting her handwriting had once stood at podiums in front of rooms far grander than the one he would soon walk into that night. He kept a single framed photograph on the shelf above the television, his late wife laughing at some joke lost to memory now. And he dusted it every Sunday morning, without ever quite letting himself linger on it too long. Their apartment was small, the furniture second-hand, the walls thin enough to hear the neighbors argue on bad nights. But it was theirs, and Adrian had built a fragile, careful peace inside it that he guarded more fiercely than any career he had once walked away from without looking back. What none of his clients knew, what none of his neighbors ever suspected as they passed him in the hallway with a polite nod, was that Adrian Cole had once been considered one of the most brilliant linguistic minds of his entire generation. He read Latin as easily as most people read the morning paper over coffee. He moved through ancient Greek, Aramaic, Akkadian, Syriac, Coptic, and archaic Sanskrit with a fluency that had once filled lecture halls with awe and left visiting scholars searching for words of their own. Universities had fought over him with fellowships and endowed chairs. Journals had begged for his research before it was even finished. But after the accident, after the funeral, no one could quite bring themselves to speak about afterward. After the long, hollow silence that followed him home each night, Adrian walked away from every title he had earned, avoided cameras and interviews entirely, and built walls thick enough that even his own brilliance could hide safely behind them, untouched and unclaimed. Across the city, in an entirely different universe, built of glass towers and private elevators, Selina Sterling moved through life the way a queen moves through the halls of her own palace. At 35, she had already built a formidable name for herself as one of the sharpest art investors in the country, a collector whose eye for rare and priceless objects had earned her the nickname the press could not resist repeating in every profile, the Queen of Rare Collections. That night, she had gathered an audience worthy of the title she wore so easily. Billionaires in tailored suits, comparing portfolios over champagne, chief executives, trading business cards like currency, university professors flown in on private jets to lend intellectual credibility to the evening, museum directors hoping to strike a lucrative partnership, and quiet, powerful collectors whose private vaults held treasures the public would never so much as glimpse. Every single one of them had come for the same reason, drawn by whispers of a manuscript unlike anything the world had seen in decades. A mystery expensive enough to justify a private jet ticket. Selina herself had spent the better part of a year building toward this single night, negotiating with the monastery's caretakers, hiring private security to escort the manuscript across 3 borders, and quietly courting journalists who could be trusted to describe the evening in the breathless language she preferred. She had rehearsed her opening remarks in front of a mirror more times than she would ever admit to anyone, certain that tonight would cement her reputation as the collector who had finally solved what the academic world could not. For Selina, wealth had never simply meant comfort. It meant control, the quiet certainty that any problem, any mystery, any closed door could eventually be opened with enough money placed in the right hands at the right moment. She had built her empire on that belief, buying paintings other collectors only dreamed of owning, funding excavations that made headlines, and surrounding herself with people who confirmed, again and again, that her instincts were correct. Tonight, she fully expected the manuscript to be another trophy in that long, glittering pattern, one more mystery bent to her will in front of an audience that mattered. The lights dimmed as the master of ceremonies stepped to the podium, his voice smooth and rehearsed, promising the crowd that the mystery manuscript would finally be revealed before the night was through, its secrets laid bare for the first time in 900 years. Servers moved silently between the tables in crisp black uniforms, refilling glasses of wine that cost more than most people earned in an entire week of honest labor. Somewhere near the back of the room, unnoticed and entirely unbothered by the spectacle around him, Adrian Cole sat quietly with his hands folded in his lap, there only because an old acquaintance from his university days had insisted he come, promising him nothing more than a free meal and an interesting evening away from his empty apartment. He had absolutely no idea that within the hour, his entire life would tilt on its axis and never quite return to where it had been. The manuscript itself had been unearthed months earlier, discovered sealed inside the crumbling walls of an ancient monastery during a renovation project that was never meant to uncover anything at all, its pages brittle with nearly 9 centuries of accumulated silence and dust. No expert who examined it in the weeks that followed could agree on where it had come from, what language it was truly written in, or who might have authored its dense, strange pages. Some scholars dismissed it outright as an elaborate forgery, a clever fraud designed to fool wealthy collectors desperate for a piece of history they could hang proudly on a wall. Others insisted just as firmly that it was the real thing, a document long thought lost to time entirely, one that could rewrite entire chapters of what the world believed. It knew about the ancient world and the fragile threads connecting it to the present. The monastery where it had been found sat halfway up a mountainside, so remote that the construction crew had needed 3 days simply to haul their equipment up the narrow stone paths, and the workers who first pried the hidden compartment open swore the air inside smelled faintly of cedar. Though no cedar had grown in that region for centuries, Selina had personally flown out to inspect the discovery the moment word reached her. Standing in a dust-filled chamber lit only by a single work lamp, running her fingers along the edge of a wooden box that had not been opened in 900 years, she had felt, even then, that this was not simply another acquisition to add to her collection, but something that could finally silence the quiet whispers among rival collectors that her instincts, however celebrated, might one day fail her. Selina stood beside the glass case that housed the manuscript, her fingers resting lightly on its edge, as though she alone had earned the right to touch something so rare. She lifted her chin toward the crowd and repeated her offer with theatrical confidence. $7,000, paid immediately and without hesitation to anyone who could translate what lay beneath the glass in front of her. The room stirred with excitement, champagne glasses lowered mid-sip, phones raised to capture the moment for later, and one by one, self-assured experts stepped forward eagerly to claim the prize that seemed at first glance, like an easy fortune. The first man studied the text for only a few minutes before offering a translation that fell apart the moment a sharp-eyed linguist in the crowd challenged his grammar with a single pointed question. The second expert fared no better, squinting at the unfamiliar characters through borrowed reading glasses before finally admitting, with visible embarrassment, that he did not recognize the writing system at all, despite 30 years of teaching ancient languages. A third scholar, more confident than the rest and eager to prove it, declared with absolute certainty that the manuscript was written in classical Latin, only to be immediately corrected by another professor, who pointed out inconsistencies no true Latin text would ever contain. Murmurs rippled through the crowd, disappointment mixing steadily with growing skepticism, and a few guests began whispering behind their glasses that perhaps the manuscript truly was a fraud after all, an expensive night wasted on a clever hoax. A fourth expert, a younger man who had built his career on television appearances rather than published research, attempted to bluff his way through a translation using half-remembered fragments of biblical Aramaic. And the resulting nonsense drew audible groans from the more serious scholars scattered throughout the crowd. A fifth attempt came from a museum curator who admitted, at least, that she was simply guessing, earning a small ripple of respect for her honesty even as she stepped down without a single coherent sentence to offer. Selena's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, her patience thinning with every failed attempt paraded in front of her most important guests, the evening's grand centerpiece threatening to collapse into an expensive, very public embarrassment. It was then that an old acquaintance, seated near Adrian, leaned over and quietly urged him to try his hand at it, nudging his elbow with a familiar grin. Adrian shook his head at first, insisting under his breath that he had no business standing in front of people who had spent their entire careers studying dead languages inside prestigious institutions. But something in the fragmented glimpse of the manuscript, even from a distance, caught his attention and refused to let go, a pattern buried beneath the apparent chaos that no one else in the room seemed to have noticed at all. As he studied it more closely, tilting his head slightly, he realized this was not one language struggling to be understood by frustrated scholars. It was several languages, layered on top of one another with deliberate precision, woven together like threads in a tapestry meant to confuse anyone who did not know exactly how to look beneath the surface. Slowly, Adrian rose from his seat and made his way toward the stage, his worn suit and unpolished shoes drawing curious, then openly amused, glances from the well-dressed crowd parting reluctantly around him. By the time he reached the front, quiet snickers had already begun rippling through the audience like a wave gathering strength, and Selena studied him with the practiced skepticism of someone who had seen 1,000 men try to impress her and fail spectacularly. She asked him plainly which university he represented, her tone crisp and expectant, assuming she would hear the name of some institution she could immediately dismiss. Or worse, one she had never even heard of before tonight. Adrian answered simply, without a trace of apology in his voice, that he represented no university at all, that he was a freelance translator, nothing more and nothing less. The laughter that followed was sharp and immediate, rolling through the hall like a wave crashing against the marble columns. And Selena allowed herself a small, cutting smile as she reminded him, loud enough for every guest to hear clearly, that $7,000 was not intended for men trying their luck on a whim in front of her most important donors. Adrian did not flinch, did not raise his voice, did not attempt to defend his credentials the way every other failed expert had scrambled to do before him. He simply looked at her, calm and entirely unshaken, and asked for nothing more than a few quiet minutes of her time. Selena studied him a moment longer, searching his face for some flicker of doubt she could use to send him back to his seat with the rest of the evening's failures. She found none. Something about his stillness unsettled her more than his worn suit ever could. And though every instinct told her to wave him away, a smaller, quieter voice reminded her that she had built her entire career on recognizing what other people overlooked. Reluctantly, she gestured toward the manuscript with an open palm, telling him he could have exactly 5 minutes before the auction moved forward without him. The tension in the room thickened, half amusement and half genuine discomfort, as the crowd waited eagerly to see how Selina would respond to a man so clearly out of his depth among them. A well-dressed businessman near the front leaned toward his colleague and muttered, just loud enough to be overheard by half the table, that perhaps this stranger believed some free online translation tool could crack a 900-year-old mystery in a matter of minutes. The comment sparked another wave of laughter, sharper and crueler this time. And the master of ceremonies took a hesitant step forward, ready to gently usher Adrian back to his seat before he embarrassed himself any further in front of the cameras quietly filming the event. But Adrian remained perfectly still, unbothered by the ridicule swirling around him like smoke he had long since learned to breathe through. He asked, politely but firmly, for a pen, a sheet of blank paper, and a small magnifying glass. And something steady in his tone made even the loudest skeptics pause mid-laugh. As the items were brought to him by a hesitant assistant, he leaned over the glass case and began examining the manuscript with an intensity no one else that night had shown, studying the pressure of the ink strokes, the subtle wear along certain edges, the precise, deliberate spacing between characters that had seemed like meaningless clutter to everyone but him. He did not attempt an immediate translation the way the others had, chasing quick answers to satisfy an impatient, restless crowd, growing hungrier for entertainment by the minute. Instead, he traced the architecture of the text itself, mapping its hidden structure with the careful patience of a man piecing together a puzzle no one else in that glittering room even realized existed beneath the surface. His fingers moved carefully along the edge of the glass case, never quite touching the fragile pages beneath it, tracing invisible lines in the air, as though rebuilding the manuscript's hidden logic one stroke at a time. Occasionally, he tilted the sheet of blank paper toward the light, sketching a rough diagram of the character spacing, crossing out an early theory, then nodding slightly to himself as a better one took its place. The magnifying glass caught the chandelier light and threw small, trembling circles across his face, and for a moment, he looked less like a man auditioning for a prize and more like someone quietly greeting an old familiar friend after years apart. Slowly, the mocking laughter around him began to quiet, replaced by a curious, uneasy silence, as a few of the visiting scholars leaned forward in their chairs, sensing that something unusual was beginning to unfold in front of them. Selina remained exactly where she stood, arms crossed tightly over her chest, still entirely convinced this stranger in the second-hand suit was wasting the most important evening of her professional calendar. After several long minutes that felt to some in the crowd like an eternity, Adrian finally lifted his head and spoke, his voice calm, but carrying an unmistakable authority that silenced even the skeptics still whispering in the back row. He told the room, plainly and without any hint of showmanship, that every single expert who had attempted this translation tonight had been wrong, not because they lacked skill or training, but because they had been reading the manuscript incorrectly from the very beginning. Gasps rippled through the crowd like a current, and Selina's eyebrows lifted in open disbelief, certain this was nothing more than the desperate bravado of a man about to fail spectacularly in front of the city's most powerful and least forgiving elite. Adrian explained, methodically and without a trace of arrogance in his voice, that the manuscript did not follow a conventional reading direction at all, and that assuming otherwise had doomed every attempt before his own. It had been constructed using 3 separate encoding systems interwoven together, a technique so rare that only a handful of scholars across recorded history had ever documented anything remotely similar to it. He identified the 3 layers precisely, one by one: Latin, Syriac, and Ancient Greek, each contributing only a fragment of meaning on its own, useless and misleading in isolation, coherent only when properly combined by someone who understood how the layers were meant to interlock. A single line, he explained patiently, meant almost nothing by itself, a deliberate trap laid centuries ago, for anyone confident enough to translate word by word, without first understanding the deeper architecture hidden beneath it. One of the visiting professors, a stern academic named Michael Hartwell, who had built his entire reputation over 3 decades studying ancient religious texts, stepped forward to challenge the claim, certain he could expose the stranger's theory as nothing more than clever nonsense. He bent low over the glass case, adjusting his own glasses, examining the characters Adrian had pointed to with a trembling finger. cross-referencing them silently against his own extensive and hard-won knowledge. Slowly, the color drained from his weathered face as the pattern became undeniable before his very eyes, the layered structure exactly as Adrian had calmly described it moments earlier. Hartwell straightened his back, looked toward Selina, with something close to disbelief written across his features, and quietly admitted, in a voice much smaller than the one he usually commanded, that the man in the worn suit appeared to be entirely correct. A hush fell over the hall as Adrian began his translation, and this time, absolutely no one dared to laugh or even whisper. He did not reach for reference books scattered nearby, did not pause to consult a single note scribbled on his blank sheet of paper, moving instead with the fluid, effortless confidence of a man reciting something he had known his entire life without ever needing to think twice. Line by line, he translated the ancient text aloud, his voice steady and unhurried, filling the silent, cavernous room with words that had waited 9 centuries to finally be understood by anyone at all. Between each passage, he paused briefly to explain the grammar structures at play beneath the surface, the historical context surrounding certain phrases, and the subtle phonetic shifts that had confused and defeated every scholar who had come before him that very evening. He continued deeper into the manuscript, tracing the origins of specific symbols back to their earliest recorded appearances in fragments scattered across forgotten libraries, explaining how certain characters had evolved and mutated across different regions and centuries. The visiting scholars, who only minutes earlier had dismissed him with open contempt and rolled eyes, now leaned forward with genuine fascination glowing in their faces, nodding along as his explanations connected details they themselves had somehow overlooked despite their formal training. Several began scribbling frantic notes on cocktail napkins, desperate to capture every word before the extraordinary moment passed them by forever, while others simply stood frozen in place, watching a masterclass unfold in real time in front of them. The grand hall, filled just minutes before with laughter and champagne-fueled chatter, had fallen into complete, reverent, almost sacred silence. Somewhere near the front, a young graduate student who had been invited only to serve as Hartwell's assistant found herself quietly crying, overwhelmed by the sight of a discovery she had assumed would never happen in her own lifetime. A photographer, hired only to capture candid shots of wealthy guests mingling over cocktails, instead filled his memory card with images of Adrian's steady hands and Selina's stunned expression, sensing correctly that these photographs would matter far more than anything else he shot that night. Adrian's voice never wavered as he moved through the final stretch of the text, each sentence landing in the silent room like a stone dropped into still water. He paused occasionally to correct himself, murmuring a small note about an alternate reading before settling on the version that fit the surrounding context most precisely. The kind of careful, honest scholarship that came only from years of discipline rather than showmanship. Even Selina, arms still crossed but no longer out of skepticism, found herself leaning forward slightly, caught entirely in the rhythm of a language she could not understand, but somehow still felt the weight of. It was near the final third of the manuscript that Adrian paused, his brow furrowing slightly as he reread a particular passage twice before he was willing to speak again. He announced, carefully and deliberately, that he had discovered something scholars had misunderstood for years, an entire section long assumed to be nothing more than a simple prayer or ceremonial blessing offered by anonymous monks. In truth, he explained, the passage was something far more significant, a formal attestation, a document meant to verify authenticity and origin, rather than offer any spiritual message at all to its original readers. The room stirred with confusion, uncertain what such a fine distinction could possibly mean for an object already presumed to be worth a considerable fortune. Adrian continued, explaining patiently that this attestation directly referenced a long-lost library, one whose very existence had only ever been rumored in fragmented historical records, never confirmed by any surviving document, until this exact moment inside this exact room. The manuscript, he revealed, was not simply an old religious text or a forgotten philosophical work gathering dust for centuries. It was proof, concrete and undeniable, tying this fragile artifact directly to one of history's most legendary lost collections of knowledge, one that scholars had searched for and never found. The implications rippled through the crowd instantly and visibly. Because if what Adrian said tonight was true, the manuscript's value had just multiplied far beyond anything anyone in that glittering room had imagined. When the evening first began with champagne and idle small talk, auction specialists exchanged stunned glances across the room, already calculating numbers far beyond the modest prize Selina had casually offered just an hour earlier that evening. One respected historian, a woman named Eleanor Voss, who had spent years quietly chasing rumors of the very library Adrian described in such careful detail, stepped forward with tears welling unexpectedly in her eyes, insisting that if his translation proved accurate under further study, this was nothing short of a genuine historic discovery. Reporters near the back of the hall who had come simply to cover another glamorous, forgettable auction, now scrambled for their phones and cameras, sensing they were witnessing something that would dominate headlines far beyond the narrow world of art and antiquities. Selina Sterling, for the first time all evening, felt her carefully constructed composure begin to crack at the edges. She stared at the manuscript, then at Adrian, then back at the manuscript again, as though trying desperately to reconcile the quiet man in the second-hand suit. With the extraordinary revelation now unfolding in front of hundreds of her closest business associates and rivals, her voice, when she finally found it, lost every trace of its earlier sharpness entirely, replaced by something quieter and far more uncertain, as she asked him plainly, almost gently, who he really was beneath the plain gray suit. It was Professor Hartwell who answered before Adrian could even open his mouth, his expression a mixture of astonishment and something that looked uncomfortably close to shame. He explained to the stunned, silent crowd that he recognized the man now standing before them under the bright stage lights, that Adrian Cole had once been among the most celebrated scholars in the entire field, a sought-after speaker at international conferences held in cities most people only saw in magazines, the author of groundbreaking research that had shaped an entire generation of linguistic study, still taught in graduate seminars. He described, in halting sentences, how Adrian had vanished from academic circles years earlier, following a personal tragedy that had never been fully explained to anyone outside his closest friends, walking away from every accolade and opportunity, without so much as a single public statement or farewell. A heavy silence settled over the room as the truth sank in slowly, and the same guests who had laughed at Adrian's worn suit only 20 minutes earlier now found themselves entirely unable to meet his eyes. Whispers spread quickly among the crowd, some guests visibly ashamed of their earlier mockery, others simply stunned that such quiet brilliance had been sitting among them all along, unnoticed and completely unbothered by the wealth and status glittering all around him. Adrian said nothing in response to Hartwell's public revelation, offering no defense, no bitterness, no demand for the respect he had clearly once commanded and just as clearly chosen to walk away from entirely. A few guests near the front began quietly asking each other why a man of such obvious talent would ever choose to disappear from a world that had once celebrated him so completely. And Hartwell, lowering his voice, explained that grief did not always announce itself the way people expected. Sometimes, he said, it simply closed a door, and the person on the other side learned to live quietly rather than risk anyone opening it again. The businessman who had joked earlier about search engines and lucky guesses now sat rigid in his chair, his earlier smugness replaced by an expression of genuine discomfort as he realized how loudly his voice had carried across the silent room. He would later approach Adrian privately, offering an awkward, mumbled apology that Adrian accepted with nothing more than a small, tired nod, unwilling to hold a grudge against a stranger for laughing at a joke that, in fairness, had seemed reasonable only 20 minutes earlier. Selina descended from the small stage slowly, her heels echoing sharply against the polished marble floor, in a room that had gone almost completely and utterly silent around her. She approached Adrian directly, closing the distance between them with visible effort, and for the first time that entire evening, there was no performance left in her expression, no practiced smile meant for cameras or nervous investors watching from the sidelines. She offered him a sincere, unguarded apology, not because his translation had proven correct, though it certainly had beyond any reasonable doubt, but because she had judged him the moment he first walked through the door, dismissing his worth based on nothing more than the cost of his suit and the quiet modesty of his introduction. She reached for the envelope containing the promised prize and extended it toward him with a hand that was, for once in her life, not entirely steady. Adrian accepted only what had been formally offered. $7,000. Nothing more, making no attempt whatsoever to leverage the extraordinary moment for greater recognition or additional compensation from a room full of people who clearly owed him far more than that. He did not boast about the discovery he had just made in front of the city's elite, did not remind the room of how thoroughly he had proven every single skeptic wrong, and offered no bitter words toward those who had laughed openly at him only minutes before his quiet triumph. Slowly, one guest began to clap. Hesitant at first, then another joined, until the entire hall rose to its feet in a wave of applause that seemed to last far longer than simple courtesy would ever require. Billionaires who rarely acknowledged anyone beneath their own considerable social standing stood clapping enthusiastically for a freelance translator in a second-hand suit, humbled entirely by what they had just witnessed unfold in front of them. Somewhere in the crowd, Eleanor Voss wiped tears from her eyes with the back of her hand, and even Professor Hartwell, a man not easily impressed by anyone after 30 years in academia, nodded slowly in quiet, genuine respect. For one brief, extraordinary moment, the glittering world of wealth and status had bent entirely towards something far rarer and far more valuable than money, genuine and unshakable knowledge. Adrian left the gala quietly, slipping out a side entrance before the crowd of reporters gathered near the front doors could catch him for a comment he had no interest in giving. He took the same bus he always took, sat in the same seat near the back, and watched the city lights blur past the window exactly as he had 1,000 times before, except this time the folded envelope in his jacket pocket felt heavier than $7,000 should have. When he unlocked the door to his apartment, Lily was already asleep, and the babysitter, a college student from down the hall, told him drowsily that she had asked twice whether her father would be home in time to check under her bed for monsters. Adrian stood in the doorway of her room for a long moment, listening to her steady breathing, and allowed himself, finally, a small and private smile that no chandelier or applause had managed to draw out of him that entire evening. News of what happened that night spread quickly across the city, and then far beyond it, and by morning, headlines across the country told a story no one in that room had expected to wake up reading. Reporters who had arrived the previous evening to cover another lavish, forgettable auction found themselves instead writing about something far more compelling and human, a quiet man whose brilliance had gone unnoticed for years, suddenly thrust into a spotlight he had spent so long deliberately avoiding. One widely shared headline captured the story perfectly, describing him simply as the man in the worn suit who had saved a piece of history everyone else in that room had already quietly given up on finding. Selena, in the days that followed, reached out to Adrian personally, not with another apology this time, but with a genuine offer that surprised even her closest advisors. She invited him to join her foundation as academic director, leading a brand new initiative dedicated entirely to preserving and studying rare ancient manuscripts before they were lost forever to time, neglect, or simple misunderstanding by people who did not know how to read them properly. It was, in many ways, an unusual proposal coming from a woman who had built her entire reputation on wealth and exclusivity, now extending her hand openly to someone who represented the quiet opposite of everything she had once valued above all else. He spoke with Lily about it one evening over dinner, half expecting her to ask him to simply stay home the way he always had, but instead, she asked whether the new job meant he would get to read even more old books than before. When he told her it likely would, she nodded with the serious, deliberate satisfaction of a child settling an important matter, and told him that sounded like exactly the kind of job her father should have. Adrian considered the offer carefully over several sleepless nights, weighing it against the quiet, guarded life he had carefully built for himself and his daughter, since the accident that had changed everything. In the end, he accepted, not because of the generous salary attached, or the prestige that came with the impressive title, but because of something far simpler and far more personal, a genuine desire to see fragile knowledge protected and passed on to people who might value it long after he himself was gone from this world. It was the first tentative step back into a world he had once fled entirely. Taken not out of ambition this time, but out of quiet, patient purpose. Over the following months, Adrian and Selena built something together that neither of them could have possibly predicted the night they first crossed paths under those glittering chandeliers. Together, they established a dedicated research fund aimed at uncovering and preserving forgotten manuscripts scattered across neglected archives and crumbling monasteries around the world. They launched an ambitious digitization project, ensuring fragile documents like the one that had brought them together would survive for future generations, no longer at the mercy of time, fire, or careless neglect by institutions too underfunded to protect them properly. Alongside their preservation work, they began training a new generation of young scholars, many of whom had never imagined that quiet, patient expertise could matter more than flashy credentials or a famous name attached to a university letterhead. Adrian insisted, from the very first meeting, that the foundation accept applicants from community colleges and overlooked backgrounds just as readily as it accepted graduates from famous institutions, remembering all too well how easily brilliance could be dismissed simply because it arrived wearing the wrong suit. Selena, to her own quiet surprise, found herself agreeing without hesitation, rewriting the foundation's charter late one night to reflect exactly that principle in its very first paragraph. Professor Hartwell joined the effort as well, no longer as a skeptic, but as one of its most devoted advocates, often telling the story of that evening to every new class of young researchers as a lesson he never wanted them to forget. Eleanor Voss eventually led the team that confirmed, after months of painstaking cross-referencing, that the lost library Adrian had identified was real, its remaining fragments scattered across 4 different countries and waiting, patiently, to be found by people willing to look carefully enough. Lily, now old enough to understand a little of what her father had done that night, kept a newspaper clipping of the story taped inside her school notebook, though she liked to tell her classmates, with a proud, matter-of-fact shrug, that her father had always been the smartest person she knew, long before anyone else figured it out. Months later, a new exhibition finally opened its doors to the public. Its centerpiece, the very manuscript that had changed both their lives so completely on a single unforgettable evening. It rested now inside a carefully lit glass case, no longer surrounded by mockery or doubt, but by quiet admiration from visitors who understood exactly what they were looking at and what it had cost to understand it properly. Beneath the manuscript, a small brass plaque bore a simple inscription, one that Adrian himself had insisted upon, including against the museum's original, more grandiose suggestions, stating plainly and without embellishment that the true value of knowledge belongs not to those who possess the most wealth, but to those who understand its meaning. Adrian stood before the glass case that evening, silent and reflective, watching the manuscript catch the soft museum lighting exactly as it had that first extraordinary night when everything had changed. Selena approached quietly and stood beside him without a word, no longer looking at him as the stranger she had once dismissed within seconds of meeting him beneath those chandeliers. This time, her gaze held something entirely different, respect earned honestly and completely, built not on appearances or hasty first impressions, but on truth revealed under pressure in front of everyone who mattered to her. Status, she had learned that night, and every day since, could make people listen to you. Wealth could make people notice you, but only knowledge, humility, and quiet, unshakable integrity could ever make people truly and lastingly respect you. And that lesson, hard-earned in front of a room full of witnesses, would stay with her for the rest of her life. Outside the museum, evening settled gently over the city, streetlights flickering on one by one along the avenue while visitors filed out through the glass doors, still speaking quietly among themselves about the manuscript and the man who had first understood it. Lily waited near the entrance, swinging her feet against the base of a marble bench, and when she spotted her father emerging with Selena beside him, she ran forward without hesitation, wrapping her arms around his waist the way she always did, unimpressed by titles or headlines, caring only that he was there. Adrian lifted her easily, the way he had 1,000 times before, and for a moment the quiet translator and the powerful investor simply stood together, watching a child laugh in the fading light. Two very different lives now woven, however unexpectedly, into the very same story. It was, in the end, exactly the kind of ending neither of them could have written on their own, the kind that only truth, patience, and a little bit of humility ever managed to create.